All right, we are live now on YouTube. So welcome to everyone who is either watching this live with us right now or watching our playback afterwards. We are just getting started with our virtual volunteer gathering for March. And so I will turn it over to Allison to kick it off.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Happy March. Kind of funny, March is almost over, but we're there. So happy March and early April coming up soon. And just wanted to give you a few updates about what we have going on at the site. It's not everything, so it's not completely comprehensive, but just some things wanted to follow up with everyone on. Is our next exhibit had a change of opening date. So our next exhibit is Untold Legacies, Rethinking the American Cowboy. And that exhibit opening is now July 14th, 12 to 5. And that will be exploring the untold stories of the African, Indigenous, and Vaquero cowboys. So very excited about that. So again, that is July 14th. And the exhibit is titled Untold Legacies, Rethinking the American Cowboy. Another big announcement is many of you may have heard is we did receive late last year an unprecedented $2 million in state funding from Assemblymember Lowenthal's office, 250 grand, and 1.75 from Senator Lena Gonzalez's office. And this money is earmarked for infrastructure and deferred maintenance projects. And as you all know, being a volunteer at the Rancho, we have no shortage of those projects. So we have a nice timeline for completing those projects. And if you have ideas, please let me know. But we will be beginning to spend those funds in 2024. But very exciting news. This is the first time both ranchos, and that is RLC and RLA, received this type of funding. So it's $2 million each. Very excited to have it, and we will be spending it. Also, in deferred maintenance project is, for those that have been curious, the veranda project is complete. It is now a very, very safe space. No, I do not want to see tap shoe dancing out there in large formations, but it is a beautiful environment. And I will say Millrock did an amazing job. Some things to notice when you're up there is when that veranda was completed, originally, none of the beams are the same width or length. So when you're up there, take a look. You can see how there's different, some planks are 5 inches, some are 9, some are 3. And in fact, the way that veranda was built is some of those planks actually serve as the ceiling to the kitchen and the library. Very interesting construction when you look at it. Pretty cool. And Alfred and I know more details than we probably ever wanted to, so we can show you where those beams intersect, but it's pretty cool. And when you're also up there and you're walking on the veranda, look at the color of the veranda floor. It is a lot lighter in color because it doesn't have all the wear and tear of years and damage. It actually looks a lot lighter than it has in the past. But Millrock, being conservation people, went through and peeled back the paint layers, and what you see up there are the actual colors. And another one for volunteers and especially docents is I challenge you when you're up there to count how many railings are in each banister section. They are not all even, and they are not all the same height. Is when you're at the portion above the library, that banister is quite a bit lower than the others because they had to sand it down so it wouldn't conflict with the adobe tiles on the roof. But yeah, you have some time, go up there and count how many little posters are in each one. None of them are the same. But very cool. It is finished. We are excited and very thankful to the Navy Trust and then a couple private donors for funding that project. But it is open. to docents and volunteers and all staff to again walk on the upper veranda. Also, thanks again to Navy Trust is another project we'll be starting in 2024 is we will be working on fixing the cracks in the adobe on the inner courtyard, in the outer walls. The Navy Trust very generously gave us funds to do that work. And we are bringing back an adobe specialist, Gil Sanchez, who had done work at the adobe quite some time ago, working on the adobe walls. So very excited about that. We're accepting our award this Thursday, but it is another exciting project that for all of us that work and breathe the adobe, for many it may not be noticed, but these are very exciting projects to help with the preservation of the adobe. So when you're there, take a look, see the differences, but it may be subtle work, but it's work nonetheless that we are making sure we are protecting the adobe in our gardens. And I know we have a beautiful topic tonight about gardens with Ms. Marie, and so I don't want to take up any more time, but there's a lot going on at the adobe, be more to come, especially about state funding and projects we're doing, more about the exhibit. So with this, Laura, I'm going to turn it back to you to kick off our program.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for all of the wonderful information. I think everybody's going to be super excited to be able to share the veranda with guests again and appreciate the grounds in bloom. And I don't want to delay any further, letting Marie share with us the treasures that she has found hidden in the grounds at Rancho Los Cerritos. Marie has only been here for 32 years, almost half the time that the rancho has been a museum. So
she's a newbie, Laura, a total newbie.
So I'm super excited to see all the things that she is going to share with us, and I'll keep talking until she gets it to that full screen mode. And she is going to share all kinds of wonderful information with us. And at the end, you'll be able to ask her questions that you discover burning in your mind, and we'll have check-ins and promote you so you can see each other if you want. She did it.
Okay. And I got off mute, which was the hard part.
And here is Marie.
Well, thank you very much. So this was a program that was initially put together many years ago for a master gardeners group that wanted to have something that nobody else had ever heard about the rancho. So that's why this was put together. Treasure trove. The phrase conjures images of treasure chests filled with precious jewels, shipwrecks with gold or silver coins, even the Lost Dutchman's mine. Now, despite John Temple's involvement with the Mexican mint, there is no reason for him to have buried a trunk full of silver for me to find. So that is not what this show is all about. When I was hired on, many of the beds were hip-high and weeds, while others were hard-packed adobe, blasted clean with gas-powered leaf blowers. Both conditions required breaking open the compacted clay to extract unwanted roots, as well as to force-feed moisture, compost, mulch, to improve the texture of the soil. The blood, sweat, and assorted bits of DNA were just extra pieces that I added. My boss at the time, Ellen Calamaris, needed me to immerse myself not only in weeds, disease, and insect control, but to learn the history of the site, as well as to brush up on local history. And she put a moratorium on planting anything for 1 year. Once the ground was softened enough to get a spading fork to penetrate, I started finding artifacts. Sadly, no gold coins, but plenty of glass, stoneware, china, iron, and a tremendous amount of butchered bones were unearthed, all of which were interesting, and each one of them had to be identified, cataloged, saved as artifacts, by the curator, Steve Iverson. Needless to say, Steve was a little overwhelmed by my harvest, and query of, "Do you have to keep digging?" was repeated more than once. The artifacts would be retrieved, placed in containers every 10 feet, so I could attribute the coordinate of each piece. The grubbed out roots were put into buckets or tarps to be hauled to the compost piles, or in the case of nutsedge, the waste bins. In some of the beds, smashing the clods of clay would reveal tiny organic treasures, bulbs and seeds that have lain in wait for decades, encapsulated in earthen tombs, so dense that moisture and oxygen had not penetrated for years, brought to the surface to be greeted with a, what have we here? And set in a third pile until the brute force version of cultivation had reached a stopping point. Understand, you are never done. They could then be reinterred in a medium that included barrow loads of compost, nestled into this breathable soil, covered in mulch, and basically forgotten by me as the battle was taken on to the next bed in line. Some months go by, and the only thing I have added to the beds was compost, mulch, and, of course, the previously mentioned DNA. And I'm getting the itch as fall sets in to plant something. I ask if I can start at this is the best time locally to get plants into the ground, but that arbitrary year was basically set in stone, so to speak. So I carried on removing the new weeds that came up, turning the soil, adding more compost, rediscovering the cache of bulbs here and there, and remulching. The majority of the beds got dug 15 to 24 inches deep, turned at least 3 times, incorporating the existing leaf rakings, mulch with additional compost. By the 3rd time around, I don't think I broke a single additional spading fork, and it went much faster. Gifted by rain that year, these beds were a dream to weed. A gentle tug would suffice, and by mid to late winter, leaves emerged that broke the pattern. These were not weeds. One of the first areas to show welcome greenery was behind the incinerator. Sword-like leaves with a solid midrib came up from netted corms in the winter, and the guessing began. Not a gladiola. How about a Watsonia? I don't know that leaf well enough. I'll just have to wait and see. Soon after that, the first of the year, suddenly blooms burst forth, striking orange flowers that were definitely not glads, nor were they Watsonia. In fact, they were Chasmantha. So, who is Chasmantha, and how did they get behind the incinerator? When they reached California is still a conundrum. By the 1890s, several South African bulbs were well established here, but sorting out the names makes verification problematic. I suspected they started alongside the incinerator in the service yard, now known as the private garden, and also served as the place for the servants to relax. They show up nowhere else on site, but with the habit of increase, the collection grew. The Bixby's gardener, Arthur Orchard, may well have tucked a bag full of bulbs where the strong foliage would play really well against the brick structure of the incinerator, and they were set for decades to come. But where did they originate? They're native to the coastal regions of South Africa. They may well have been familiar to the earliest explorers, and distribution of the plant occurred as early as the 1600s. This is prior to the Dutch East India Company's colonization of the region. These plants were growing in Paris, France, at the gardens of Henry IV, and available to artist Jacques-Philippe Cornu. He did not travel, but studied and illustrated both native and exotic plants from the royal and other gardens. He published 2 books, one on local plants, and the second, Canadensivum Plantarum, included plants of Canada from the St. Louis River to Louisiana, and for some reason he added 5 South African bulbs, one of which happened to be this very same Chasmantha. Painted while in bloom in 1633, it was unknown to Cornu, so he took a guess and labeled it gladiola. Almost 260 years later, the first scientific record I could find shows up. It was a type specimen collected by Peter McGowan in 1892 and sent to England, where it was named by a fellow named Salisbury as a neotype plant. Englishman McGowan was a professor and administrator of several educational establishments, and eventually the director of Cape Town Botanic Gardens. His botanizing started prior to his employment as a principal and a chemistry professor. He used botany as an intellectual entertainment. He had a small collection before moving to South Africa and endeavored to enhance it for his own pleasure. And what a better plant community to expand your interest than South Africa. Sometimes hobbies get away from you, however. He started corresponding with leaders in the field in England, Australia, and America, sending them dried specimens of plant material to study. Soon, requests started coming in not just for one sample, but for several so they could be shared and studied in more than one institution. It got to the point where he formed the South African Botanical Exchange, a group of amateur botanists who would bring their offerings to him, he would then package and distribute. But even that was not always an easy task. In a letter to Asa Gray in 1874, he wrote, "Might I ask the favor of your informing Judge Clinton of Buffalo that I shall have to ask his faith and forbearance for a few months. A parcel of plants, 560 species, destined for shipment to him, was destroyed in transit to the bay by the overturning of a wagon in one of our swollen, bridgeless rivers last June. I have hardly yet plucked up heart or grace to recommence and see what can be done to replace it." Now, fortunately, many of his specimens did make it safely across rivers, bridged or otherwise, as well as oceans. Linnaeus placed several bulbous plants in the genus Anthelysa in 1759. In 1812, botanist Richard Salisbury reviewed the collection and with a keen eye determined enough difference to merit 2 species rather than just one, dividing Anthelysa aethiopica to reflect Aethiopica floribunda as well. Well, a meticulous botanist, most of his work was ignored once he plagiarized an associate's work and published it under yet another person's name. The actual author wrote of Salisbury, "I scarcely know what to think of him, except that he stands between a rogue and a fool." Many botanists continued to tinker and shift the names about. Brown broke Anthelysa into 9 separate genuses in 1932. He was a taxonomist working at Kew as assistant keeper, and he specialized in succulents throughout the Cape, but worked on bulbs too. And it was he who established the name Chasmantha, of which he included 9 species. The moniker Chasmantha is based upon the Greek chasmame for yawning or gaping, and anthos for flower. Floribunda refers to the many flowers it produces. Lewis did not stop there. Other botanists disagreed and shifted it about. In 1950, Lewis showed that the genus Chasmantha was in fact distinct with 3 species, all from South Africa. This was confirmed in 1971 and again in 1976. But imagine the challenge of determining which plant was being discussed without image or details any time prior to that. These corms were found near the coast of the Northern Cape to the peninsula within a rocky outcroppings consisting of both sandstone and granite, as well as dolomite deposits. It wants good light and drainage during the winter rains and cool growing conditions. It does not tolerate hard freezes. Of the 3 species that remained in the genus, this is the largest and the most floriferous. The flattened corms are covered in a fibrous, papery netting caused by the remains of old leaf bases. Once the rains begin, the foliage emerges and keeps growing. The sword-shaped leaves are hairless and have a definite midrib. It forms two ranks, fans, easily growing 6 feet and maybe a little bit taller. The flower stalk is upright and typically stands equal to or taller than the foliage, and it can be branched. The 20 to 40 flowers themselves fan out in a flat pyramid on either side of the stem, with the base opening first. A small but noticeable bract forms at the base of the bloom, persisting after the flower drops. Individual blooms have 6 fused petals, and they measure just less than 3 inches long. The anthers borne on filaments are exserted, meaning they extend beyond the petals. The style divides at the tip and supports 3 stigmas. Flowering occurs in the midwinter, and studies reflect that these flowers are adapted to a specialist nectar-feeding birds. These sturdy, non-fragrant, brightly colored long tubular flowers produce a rich and great quantity of nectar, far greater than you'll find in shorter flowers. To generate pollen, the specialist must plunge headfirst into the flower to access the nectar while collecting pollen on the feather of the bird's head. Evolution between the long-billed malachite sunbird and chasmantha, as well as similarly structured flowers, is typical of the Cape floristic region. The malachite sunbird will grasp the stem with its feet while burying its bill deep into the flower. The fused tube of the flower prevents the long beak from the bird penetrating the ovaries, but still manages to get placement on the pollen on the feathers of the head. Those pollen grains will then get deposited at the next flower the bird visits. There is competition from the more common lesser double-collared sunbird. The second songbird has a short bill and cannot reach the deep nectar. So rather, what they do is they puncture the base of the flower, steal the nectar without doing anything at all for the benefit of the plant. Should the sunbirds do their job, plenty of bright orange flesh-covered seeds are greatly enjoyed by seed-dispersing birds, including starlings. Meanwhile, underground, the stem, or corm, is forming offsets, baby corms. These will build up over time, forming a mound of significant portions, while the oldest decay. Now, hummingbirds flash and dart from one brightly colored blossom to the next. However, as they sip the nectar on the wing, they rarely plunge their head in deeply, so I have never seen seeds produced here in Southern California. I could find no ethnic botanic reference other than the fibrous leaves were used in basketry. This I can believe, as they are tough, requiring sharp shears to cut them down. The flowers are a bold statement in a large vase, as well as the spent flower stems with their interesting bracts, really beautiful in the vase. In the same flower bed as the chasmantha were large knobbly seeds. These sprouted to reveal themselves to be tropaeolum, more commonly known as nasturtiums. Native to South America, tropaeolum are found in the lower elevation of the Andes of Bolivia and Colombia. These water-loving annuals are found near rivulets of mountain slopes, covering as much ground as they can. The first nasturtium was described by Nicolas Menardez, a Spanish physician and plant collector in Seville. He received seeds from Peru in 1569. That plant turned out to be Tropaeolum minus, and seeds were sent further afield to England, where the gardening community was enchanted by them. John Parkinson found it to be the prettiest of a score in the garden, but he deemed it to be without medicinal value. That is not the case, especially for the larger species. It was understood early on that the leaves, stems, flowers, and seeds were edible, but the world at large would have to wait for 300 years to meet our common nasturtium. This would be thanks to a self-made man, Otto Kunz of Germany, who started as an apothecary and tradesman prior to building a factory for distilling essential oils. So successful was he that he retired a young wealthy man after only 5 years, at which time he chose to focus on natural history, and he took an around-the-world tour spanning 2 years. He already had a collection of local plants, but upon his return, he had amassed 7,700 plant specimens. Now, the Linnaean binomial system of naming plants was established, but Kunz took issue with it and devised his very own system. He self-published Revisio Generum Plantarum, 3 volumes, using his new system in 1891. Publishing names for plants newly discovered is problematic enough, but he expected the world to follow his lead, and he changed the botanic names of every plant already named. While many recognized that some changes were needed, they felt it should be handled moderately and with discussion. No need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. When the world did not embrace his concept, Kunz made things worse by attacking the botanists in print, further reducing his credibility. Linnaeus, who had named Tropaeolum minor, saw the specimen growing up a post in full bloom. He was reminded of a habit the Greeks had of hanging helmets, shields, and weapons of their defeated enemies upon a tree and calling it tropaeon, which this old coin reflects happening. The Greek word of tropaeon stands for trophy. With the flowers representing helmets and the round foliage as shields, he felt this was a worthy tribute to the plant. Linnaeus named the nasturtium, brought back by Kunz, Tropaeum majus, as this species was so much grander than Tropaeum minor. Linnaeus is the man who devised the system of binomial nomenclature, scorned by Kunz, so he is well known, his family less so. Yet his 19-year-old daughter is credited with the Elizabeth Linnaeus phenomenon. She observed that as dusk fell, the orange flowers seemed to emit a small flash. Initially, it was thought this was an electrical phenomenon. It was determined that instead the flash lies in the eye of the beholder, and she figured this out. It is literally an optical reaction to the contrast between the orange flowers and the green foliage that the eye records as a flash. And of Kunz, the International Botanic Congress met in 1905, in part to address some of the issues that Kunz complained about. He was invited to attend, and he appeared, but late in the session, only to denounce the men and their work. The common name nasturtium gets broken down into 2 words, nassus for nose and tortoise for twist. This refers to the pungent aroma that may well have caused Europeans to wrinkle their nose at the scent of nasturtiums. They may not have found favor of the scent, but they were in absolute favor in the garden. Le Notre added them to King XIV's extensive gardens. While the king grew them for bold color, the common folk, who were suffering something fierce, grew them for food. Did you know that nasturtiums have the highest concentration of vitamin C of any vegetable? The peasants, not only in France, but throughout Europe, were able to ward off scurvy from an inadequate diet by eating that which the king used only to impress. They were also catching on that they seemed to counteract some health issues. They did not yet understand about germs, but the antibacterial properties were beginning to be noticed when used on festering wounds or sinus or urinary tract infections. So they were consumed in spring salads and were thought to cleanse the blood. There were more than minor and majus introduced, but those 2 seemed to do the best. Hybridizers started tinkering, and a double variety came out in Italy in 1769, and in 1850, Tom Thumb series, a bedding variety with less sprawl was introduced. If you look in the right catalogs, you can still get Tom Thumb today. By 1878, at the World Exposition in Paris, there were 30 varieties of nasturtiums available for sale. The Victorians loved them, and the language of flowers, popular at the time, identified them with patriotism and splendor. Different texts appeared reflecting different meanings of them. So sometimes the book would say, "I wish to be a nun." I can only imagine the misunderstandings of young couples when they were deciphering the nosegays from different lists. Naturally, it made its way across the pond. Thomas Jefferson had them in Monticello, where he listed them as a fruit, indicating that he was pickling the flower buds similar to capers. Colonial Williamsburg and a Moravian community on North Carolina were growing them as vegetables for the edible foliage and flowers. They hit the West Coast with the Franciscan missionaries, who likely ate them, as well as potentially decorating the altars with them, hoping to inspire vocations for nuns, perhaps. Back on the East Coast, Bernard McMahon was selling seeds for both Minas and Magus in Philadelphia in 1806. Out here on the West Coast, Mrs. Theodosia Shepherd of Ventura and her seed and plant company became renowned by 1886 for her hybrids, including nasturtiums. And so this vegetable became an ornamental. Flash forward to 1931, Elizabeth Bodger of Bodger Seeds won the first ever All-American Selection Award for the Golden Gleam nasturtium. Nasturtiums here at the Rancho were here by 1860s, and plentiful enough for the kids to play with. The young Bixby's called them nasty tertiums, once again due to the odor. No records show if these were descendants of plants from Temple's earlier garden or if they were introduced by the Bixby's. They would certainly have been available to both. Monet planted nasturtiums in his garden at Gavarnie. They were subject of more than one of his paintings. During World War II, nasturtium seeds were ground up and utilized as pepper substitute when importing the normal black pepper became interrupted. In 1992, while weeding and turning over the soil behind the incinerator, several nasturtium seeds were brought to the surface. The following spring, they sprouted as a carpet and have been spreading ever since. They started in a bed that we once called the weekend gate and have spread with determination along the fence line up to the garage. Much of this area is dappled shade, and they get minimal, if any, additional water. Yet the springtime display evokes startled exclamations from visitors who ask, "What do you do to get them so lush?" Nothing is the truth. After I loosened up the soil, they have done the rest. As they clamber on top of nearby plants, I pull them back with a reprimand, and when the weather heats up, rather than watering them to prolong the season, I start ripping them out. Our soil is heavy clay with low nitrogen, but all the other minerals are present and accounted for. Most of the area they cover has been heavily mulched with ground-up tree trimmings for weed suppression, and the nasturtiums seem to like it a lot. Over the decades, I have witnessed a few color changes, with the occasional yellow or something as deep as almost red popping up. On the other side of the wall, in the backyard, once used for primarily annuals that could be harvested for floral arrangements, was the Bixby cut flower garden. This was typical of estate gardens of the period, and photos show snapdragons and iris, but no written record has turned up yet to see what else they planted. This was one of the areas that I rediscovered small bulbs with each turning of the soil. A retired British naval surgeon John Giles suffered from tuberculosis, so he left Britain at age 28 to become a botanist and an explorer of Argentina and the environs. This young Scotsman arrived in Argentina in 1820 and started collecting plants post-haste. Amongst the first collected was Iphigenia, samples of which he sent along to William Hooker, director of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. Giles spent 8 years in this endeavor, collecting many plants, 9 of which bear his name, including a relative to the Caesapolinia we have in the forecourt, and 1 moth. This small bulb seems to have been overlooked by foragers, and no records show that it has ever been used as a food source. Research reflects that while the Iphigenia is not terribly poisonous, neither does it have any medicinal purpose. Just now, because you collect a new specimen does not mean that it gets named immediately. In the case of Iphigenia, it was not described until 1836, when Constantine Rafinesque examined herbarium samples, recognized that it had been lumped incorrectly with something called Milia. Nor was Giles the only adventurer sending botanical specimens from the region. Kew alone had 10 type specimens, so synonyms accumulated quickly, and as biologists tweaked, argued, shifted the name of this humble bulb, it was enough to make your eyes cross. John Linley's botanical illustration graced the Botanical Register, listing the plant as Tritelia uniflora in 1837. The name has continued to be played with right up until the 1970s, which can make it a challenge again while researching old bulb catalogs. The Bixbys did not keep a record of what was planted after the garden was installed by Ralph Cornell in the 1930s. In the 90s, the cut flower garden was thigh-high in oats. The ground was as hard as an adobe brick, so deep soaking, excavating, smashing clods commenced, and a plethora of pieces of the past were revealed, including these small bulbs. Not being a bulb ID maven, I had no idea what they were, but I set them aside, incorporating all that had been previously mentioned until the earth was friable, at which time I replaced and mostly forgot about them as I moved on to the next hardpan selection. The next winter, slightly cupped glaucous leaves emerged. As weeding was a regular task in the improved areas, these were spotted right quickly as something other. The fact that they smelt of onion was noted early on. When they bloomed, they were easy to identify, even if the names were confusing. These were well-mannered bulbs, seemed to spread by cheerful manner and carpeted the ground with white stars with a blue tinge. As the flower spikes get no taller than 6 to 8 inches, it can be a challenge to sniff for perfume. If your nose happens to be near the ground and you have not disturbed the onion-scented foliage, you will get a sweet fragrance likened to honey and or violets, depending upon who you ask. It is a rare treat for those of you who want to crawl across the ground to smell the flowers. For a decade or more, they seemed to be happy, but the carpet became less dense, so I turned the soil over again. Less blood and fewer tears this time around, added compost and replanted. It was worth the effort, for the carpet returned. And once again, they were greeted with delight as they turned their faces to greet the light of the winter sun and came to be recognized and celebrated as true survivors. We replaced the overhead irrigation system in 2017, trying to reduce our water consumption. A drip system using Netafim was installed. The mist that had been there turned into a drip, and the carpet is gone as large swaths of the soil remain dry when we get minimal rain. But those along the drip line return every year and are lovely to look at. They are currently in bloom right now. Yet another bulb was unearthed in my tilling, this one larger than Iphigenia, far more round in shape. These bulbs were unearthed in 2 locations, nearby the Tengello, adjacent the kitchen, and at the far end of the bed from the corner, near the corner of the backyard and the maintenance yard. When the foliage emerged, it was far different from those previously described, thick and fleshy with a gentle cup to the strap-shaped leaves. The hollow scape rises from the center of the leaves, encircled by 10 to 30 delicate blue flowers. No fragrance was present, but the flowers were charming and they did wonderful in light shade. These are Hyacinthioides hispanica, Spanish bluebells. Native to the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Spain, and Northwest Africa, these charming flowers were imported as early as the 1600s. Because they had a wide natural range and multiple parties were importing them, once again thinking they were the first to find them, multiple names confused the situation. Linnaeus had already named the type species Hyacinthioides nonscripta, the famed English bluebell, as it looks rather like a small version of hyacinth. However, these flowers are found only on one side of the scape, the flower stalk. When the new species was being named, Linnaeus applied Hispanica to the species. Chaccord named the species Endymion hispanica, thinking it differed in many aspects. Having flowers surrounding the scape, a lack of fragrance, a deeper blue color, it has to be something different. But others felt it was yet a different genus altogether, and placed it with Scilla, generally keeping Hispanica, but sometimes using Campanulata instead for the species. Naturally, all three genus were published, leading to much confusion and frustration right up to recent history. When introduced to the United Kingdom, the Brits welcomed this relative of their own native bluebell. What they did not anticipate was that the two would hybridize, the result being Hyacinthioides cross Massartiniana. Problematically, the hybrid invades the natural colonies of nonscripta and now threatens it altogether. While nonscripta has been investigated for medicinal or other cultural uses, including grinding up the bulb and using it to stiffen the ruffs that they once wore in Elizabethan times, not in Elizabethan times, it was ignored and rated poorly and hardly at all published. John Byron's bulb book urges gardeners to plant not a few of these at a time, but large quantities. And I have to agree, these look lonely when they're all by themselves, but lovely in mass. Today we have these blooming in the two areas already discussed, and we have another smaller group in the private garden, right by the gate to the garage. Oops. Unlike the others we have discussed, Viola odorata did have one sorry specimen that lingered longer above ground. One lonely plant stressed by heat, sun-scorched, and freckled by spider mites. It was a pitiful sight. The process of renovation previously described apparently turned up a plethora of seeds unnoticed, this time by me. The first indication of their presence was after the rains brought forth the tidy clumps of fresh green leaves from the newly arable soil the next winter. The perimeter bed with the crepe myrtle was carpeted with greenery, as was one of the cut flower gardens. Smaller drifts hither and yon were noted as well. So what is their story? Violets are native to Europe, Africa, and Asia, and their history was more experienced than recorded. The earliest herbarium species at Kew in London is dated 1835, but this small plant has a huge history dating back well before ancient Greece. Origin stories include bloodletting that triggers Violet's appearance, Adonis's death by wild boar, or Aphrodite by pricking her foot. Less bloody, but with drama worthy of the Greeks, are the following tales. Orpheus with his lute charmed all the birds and beasts, the woods and mountains. The flowers also arose and danced a magic circle around him. And when he sank down, wearied upon a bank to sleep, upon the spot where his enchanted lute had fallen, there sprang into bloom the first violet, which, through the embodiment of purest music, yet is itself forever mute, and nestles down amidst its leaves, listening to the everlasting harmonies of nature. the magic music of the lute still haunts the scent of violets. More unsavory was the story of Persephone and Pluto. Persephone had spurned Pluto's suit, so he went over her head to Zeus, who gave permission to Pluto that he could kidnap the young maiden without reprisal. Knowing her love for flowers, he came upon her and her handmaidens, collecting roses, violets, lilies, daffodils, etc., takes her to his realm, the underworld. Fast forward to the time where Persephone spends only half the year with Pluto. A heartbroken Orpheus is mourning the loss of his wife, Eurydice, from a serpent's bite. He travels to Hades to beg Pluto and Persephone the boon of having Eurydice back. He faces many dangers, but playing his lyre, he calms beasts and storms, etc., and eventually plays his music in the underworld. As he does so, the scent of violets in spring fills the air. Persephone's eyes grow blank, feeling the pull of spring, when she returns to the world above. Pluto sees this and hurriedly agrees to Orpheus's request, but with a stipulation that Orpheus not look back at Eurydice until there is once again above the ground. He eagerly agrees and they set forth, but doubt assails Orpheus, and of course he looks back, only to see his beloved wrenched away once and forevermore. Or yet another myth. Zeus, already in trouble with his wife Hera for his lustful wanderings, fails to keep his word and seduces beautiful Io. Fearing being found out, he attempts to hide his lover from his jealous wife, initially by forming a thick cloud cover between Olympus and the ground. Hera finds the odd cloud cover peculiar and starts to investigate, dispersing the clouds in the process. Lounging with Io, Zeus observes the dissipating clouds and suspects Hera's interference. He then turns Io into a beautiful white heifer. Thank you very much. When Hera sees Zeus standing next to a stunningly beautiful cow, her suspicious nature goes into overdrive. She admires the cow, and Zeus says he has no knowledge of it. It just appeared before him. So Hera asks if she may have it as a gift. Feeling trapped, he agrees and gives Hera his lover. Meanwhile, Io, now a cow, grazes on tough grass and resents it. So Zeus allows that where she grazes, violets will spring up. Hera sends Io to be guarded by Argus. Zeus sends Hermes to rescue Io. Hera is totally peeved, so she sends an enchanted gadfly to torment Io to the point she can neither eat nor sleep, but wanders the world attempting to escape the torment. Maddened beyond endurance, she plunges into the sea, fords river, and eventually reaches the Nile. Zeus settles with Hera that he will never again look upon Io's perfect features. Io is returned to human form, manages to raise a family, possibly sired by Zeus. The Greek word for violets was initially vion, which evolved into ion. The geography of where Io as a heifer wandered is commemorated by the Ionian Sea, the Bosphorus, which means ford of the cow, and anything else with Io in it. The Greek poet Homer mentions them frequently in his epic poems. When the Romans arrived in Egypt, they wrote of the overpowering fragrance of the flowers, including violets. So powerful was it that they were concerned that the scent could obscure their mind and impair their judgment. Roman poet Virgil, however, followed Homer in praising the dainty flower. Christianity often embraces and sanctifies the uses of tried and true celebrations and iconic habits. In the case of the violet, it came to symbolize the Virgin Mary's humility. Violets are occasionally called Our Lady's modesty. This refers to when the angel Gabriel tells Mary that she had been chosen to bear the Son of God. Mary humbly replied, "Behold, I am the handmaiden of the Lord," and the violet bloomed. Humility, taken even further, is from whence the term shrinking violet is based upon. Violets can be violet, lavender, yellow, and white. One legend has it that they were all said to be white, until Mary was so filled with anguish over the fate of her son that the white flowers sympathetically turned deep purple to reflect the measure of grief. Purple, as well as black, has been the color of mourning ever since. There is another version that violets once were upright until the shadow of the cross fell upon them, and at which point the flowers faced down, shamed at what mankind had done. In the 17th century, the Prophet Muhammad favored violets above all flowers, while 6 centuries later, Genghis Khan was said to have moved his army westward, subsisting upon the roots of violets. Springing forward 1,000+ years or so, the violet was popularized in the 18th century France by Napoleon and Josephine. Widowed by the Revolution and just barely escaping the guillotine herself, when the Revolution ended prior to her execution date, Josephine, with 2 children to support, became mistress to men who could support her family. She caught the attention of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1795, and thinking he might become her next patron, courted his favor. Instead, he proposed marriage in 1796. She was hesitant as she found him, silent and awkward with women, passionate, lively, and altogether strange in his person. But she said yes anyway. At the time, he held the city of Parma, famous for their violets, Josephine's favorite flower. Thus, he was able to supply her with all she could ever want. Josephine carried violets at her wedding, and they were embroidered onto her gown. Each wedding anniversary, Napoleon would send her violet bouquets, even if he happened to be in the midst of battle. While she had many, her favorite perfume was violet, which enabled her to have the fragrance around her even when out of season. Josephine was unable to bear the son that he desperately wanted, so 14 years later, confirmed barren, he divorced her. She retired to her estate, Malmaison, where she grew violets and roses. Napoleon, in a quest for a dynasty, married Marie-Louise and fathered Charles. Ironically, Marie's favorite perfume was also violet. Despite being remarried, he still loved Josephine and considered her a confidant, saying the only thing between them were her bills. If you take a look at this drawing, hidden in the print are the silhouettes of Napoleon Bonaparte, his wife, and their child. Now, I can't see the viewers of this, so I can't have you show a raise of hands of how many can see it. So this is what I'm going to do for you instead. If you look at the right-hand upper oval, you will see that the leaf is Bonaparte's hat. If you follow it to the left, down the purple flower, that's his brow and his nose. And the green leaf shows his nose, his lips, his chin. If you look at the oval on the left, this is Marie-Louise. And the top flower shows her hair. And then the flowers to the right reflect her nose, her lips, her chin, and then her throat. And the red one at the bottom shows Charles' silhouette. Along the stem and facing the green leaf, you will see his nose and lips. Pretty cool. When Napoleon attempted to overthrow the existing government, and that effort resulted in his capture, he was sentenced to imprisonment on the island of Elba. 2 months after his incarceration, Josephine died. He spent the next 2 days locked in his room, seeing no one. Napoleon told his confidants that he would return to France carrying violets. Oops, wrong direction. Still wrong direction. They believed that to mean in the spring. And images of violets appeared in multiple mediums. Ladies' bonnets, violet ribbons on gowns, jewelry, rings, pendants, earrings, stick pins displayed enamel violets, carved violets, or just the color violet. Embellished snuff box, sometimes with violet snuff, became fashionable. His supporters created the code, Aimez-vous la violette? Do you like the violet? Should the individual queried answer yes or no, it would prove they were not a supporter of Napoleon. If, however, the response was, eh bien, reparaît au printemps, translated to, he will reappear in the spring, and so their affiliation would be clear. They also referred to Napoleon as Corporal Violetta. When he escaped, the flower stalls were filled with violets, which his supporters wore proudly. He took time to visit Josephine's tomb and stayed at her estate at Malmaison, while there he plucked some violets and saved them. He was only to reign for 100 days, and this time upon capture he was sent to Helena, where he lived out his days. He died at the age of 51 and was found to be wearing a locket with Josephine's hair and petals of the violets he had picked from her home. While Bonaparte's ambition was thwarted, the artists continued to embellish china, linens, greeting, and postcards with images of violets. Hair, dresses, hats, all sported real or artificial violets. An English fruit grower, George Lee, decided to branch out and started growing violets for sale. He imported plants from France, but they did not do so well in England's colder climate. Not ready to give up, he imported more plants from Russia. These proved to be more adaptable, and he started hybridizing them. Still, even with this sideline, his business was not doing well. He knelt in his nurseries and prayed for guidance. Opening his eyes at last, he saw a larger flowered, beautiful violet growing in between two beds. He sent a bunch of them to Queen Victoria, asking her if he could name it Victoria Regina. She agreed, and they became known as the Clevedon violet after his growing grounds, and was exported worldwide. He sent Victoria a posy every week in gratitude. Botanically, violet leaves emerge from a stolon in a clump of leaves. The stolon extends, rooting along the way, allowing another clump to appear. In late winter, here in California, the fragrant flower appears at or slightly above the foliage. If the weather is fair, mason bees or small flies may follow the nectar guides to the nectary, collecting pollen as they reach the sweet nectar. If the weather is harsh, and the season will be a bust for violets. Evolution provided not only the stolon as a survival measure, but a trait known as kleistogamy. Kleisto is Greek for closed, and this adaptation is a closed, perfect flower that follows in the summer and never rises above the foliage. These closed flowers are self-fertile, which means they carry the traits of only one parent. When the seed capsule ripens, it will curve downwards, sometimes back into the soil, bursting open to disperse the seeds. The hard-coated seeds have an eleosome, an appendage that looks a bit like a larva, oily and white, that ants love. They take the whole seed back to the colony to feed the brood, and when it is time to tidy the colony up, they remove the now bare seed and deposit it in their midden or waste heap, a happy place indeed for a seed. The sterile nature of the violet's flower later led them to be associated with pure and innocent love. The Victorian language of flower has the violet standing for faithfulness and modesty. Violets have been used medicinally probably before recorded time. Athenians believed it would moderate anger, procure sleep and comfort, strengthen the heart. Pliny the Elder prescribed a liniment of violet root and vinegar to treat gout and disorder of the spleen, while a chaplet or garland of violets worn upon the head will dispel the fumes of wine and prevent headache and dizziness. The Romans, of course, took this mean that if you consume it with the wine, it would prevent the hangover. And so rather than moderate consumption, they drank viola wine while wearing a garland of violets upon their head. No records have been found to show that this beverage could be consumed without fear of a hangover. In England, Gerard used the leaves as plasters and poultices, reducing bruising, and Culpeper found it mild in nature and in no way hurtful. Used as an eye wash, drunk in water or wine to ease pains of the heart, he felt the leaves were stronger than the flowers, seeing that they purge the body of choleric humors and assuageth the heat if taken in a draught of wine or other drink. The purple petals picked and dried, mixed with water and drunken, treated quinsy, jaundice, and the falling sickness of children. The flowers also ripen and dissolve swellings that treat pleurisy and all diseases of the lungs. Macer's herbal considered it powerful against wicked spirits. Violets, in fact, contain salicylic, which is aspirin. It is so truly does it help headaches, migraines, insomnia, high blood pressure, and possibly hangovers. An extract will induce sweating and thus reduce fever. It also treats cancers of the breast, lungs, and digestive tract. Poultices from the leaves and root do reduce inflammation. The leaves and flowers, cooked into a syrup, treat sore throats, sinus, and lung congestion. Violets are edible and can be added to salads, used to decorate pastries, fresh or candied, flavor syrup or vinegars. The leaves are mild enough to make a salad of them only if you use the new tender leaves. I got to tell you, the older ones don't work so well. They're very tough. They can also be added to soup as well, and they will thicken the broth, much like okra. Leaves and flowers can also be brewed into a tea. The perfume was touched upon earlier. Both flowers and leaves are harvested. The flower for the sweet floral scent, and the leaves for a fresh green scent used in blends. Violet's fragrance has a fleeting feature built in. Once you get a good waft of it, your olfactory senses shut down and stop recognizing it. A few moments later, you might catch it again, only to have it once again disappear. In 1893, two German scientists discovered the chemical formula of the flower's elusive fragrance, patented it. They called it ione. Today, the fragrance used in perfumery is chemical typically rather than the essential oil. As recently as 1923, they were still harvesting violets and leaves for perfume. 1,000 kilograms of leaves produced 300 grams of absolute oil. So the chemical version allows many of us to enjoy the fragrance of queens and empresses. Here at the Rancho, Avis Bixby was known to have three favorite flowers: Shasta daisy, sweet pea, and sweet violets. Of all of these, only the seeds of the violets lingered longer to turn up 40+ years after she moved off site, to once again carpet the flower beds at Rancho Los Cerritos. That long ago winter, when these buried treasures emerged, my boss actually thought I had defied her and planted new material. For none of these plants had been seen blooming in living memory, with the exception of that one sorry violet. Turning over and improving the soil, we opened a treasure chest of botanical gems, rich in history, much further extending beyond the rancho's history, but celebrated each year when they once again embellished the rancho's gardens. And that is my end of my program.
Thank you, Marie. That was wonderful.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I did. It wasn't exactly what I was expecting, but it was wonderful nonetheless. All kinds of extremely interesting information. Do we have any questions? No? Well, why don't we start promoting people, and they can ask questions and we can check in and see if anybody has anything they want to share. So it will seem like you're leaving, and but then you'll reappear. Not working for me at all. I see people are slowly emerging on the screen. I'm not able to promote people for some reason. But looks like you promoted all that are promotable.
I think we have some people declining, which is okay. Let's give one more attempt. But again, even if you would not like to be a panelist and share your video, you're still welcome to use the chat. Or if you're having trouble becoming a panelist, you can also use the chat. We'll try to figure that out as well. But I think this is everyone we're going to get to join the panelist side for now.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Did anybody have any questions they wanted to ask Marie? Okay, well, then I think we can move into our check-ins. So we had decided that we weren't going to have a standard prompt. Is that midnight that is Marie has a friend with her. To share something. So I had a fun day. I went hiking and I saw a roadrunner, which was super exciting. So I haven't seen one for decades, and I don't think I've ever seen one in Southern California. So that was my exciting day. And well,
Roadrunner bird?
a roadrunner bird, yes.
Because we have one in our neighborhood here that I just seen recently.
Oh, that's what I remember somebody talking about, a roadrunner. Yes.
More than once. And I just took a picture recently. It's kind of by the flood control down there, but there's roadrunners around here.
That's why I asked if you'd saw it at the river.
Oh, right. So you see it?
Yeah, I saw it about 2 weeks ago and we took a picture. And I've seen it before just walking around on Daisy here, right on the street. But where did you see yours?
Crystal Cove State Park. Hiking up the canyon, Morrow Canyon. Actually, it was on No Name Trail, but yeah, down there in Newport Coast. So that was fun. And well, I guess I had another fun thing happen today. I got a new chicken and she lays green eggs.
What do you feed her?
What do I feed her? It's dependent on their genetics, not what you feed them. But it's a kind of chicken called vario ovo, and which means the color of eggs, they vary. And this is the second one I got. The first one I got because I wanted them to lay blue or green eggs and brown eggs. So I was really happy when I got another one and it lays green eggs. Blue eggs would be even happier, but I'm happy with green eggs. So, anybody else have anything exciting they want to share for the day? Okay, well, I will make a few announcements. What's coming up? Next month, we are going to have a field trip to the Dominguez Adobe. I think we'll gather at the rancho and we can carpool over and have a picnic lunch with some of their volunteers, and then they will take us on tours of the Adobe. So that will be our gathering of volunteers rather than our typical brown bag or virtual gathering like we're having tonight. And then the next month, it will be our volunteer appreciation dinner in May. This coming weekend is unusual in that we will be closed to the public on Saturday, but Beer Fest, or Craft Beer Fest, is going to be happening at the Rancho, and there are several volunteers that are going to be volunteering and helping us show off the museum to people that may have never been there before. But we will be open as usual on Sunday. And that's all the announcements I can think of. So if nobody has anything they would like to add, we can wrap it up.
Well, I will add one thing.
Yes.
Spring equinox occurs tonight
Yes.
within the next hour. So, and this is considered the first day of spring.
Happy first day of spring it is.
Oh, I thought of something exciting. I saw the wisteria is starting to bloom.
Last week.
It is.
Yeah.
It is starting to bloom, and you can see it. This past weekend, I was having volunteers and docents take people into the sun porch upstairs so that people could see the wisteria blooming because we couldn't go out on the veranda. And yeah, it was very exciting. We had a big weekend on Saturday. We had over 100 people come to visit the Rancho. So yes, people heard that flowers are blooming and they're showing up in droves. So if you haven't been by, come on over and see us. All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you around the Rancho very soon. Adios.
Have a great spring.